Okay, welcome to our channel. I'm Jay LaValle and this is Joe Janitz.
Hello.
In honor of Stan Lee, we're going to do, in Thanksgiving, we're going to do an episode in honor of Stan Lee.
Yeah, and we owe this man a lot for what he brought to everybody growing up when we did. An escape from reality, a change of the thought of nuclear bombardment, the nuclear power issues that they were just delving into, government, the way it was, and who we were going to war with, and the axis of evils. There were a lot of things that the comic books got kids through. Science, math. Believe it or not, if it wasn't for Marvel Productions and Stan Lee, the characters, there would have been a greater divide. Comics taught people to accept people for not only who they were, but what they were.
Right.
Yeah. The popular titles, you had Spider-Man, you had the X-Men, Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, and the Hulk.
Yeah. Spider-Man started off in Amazing Fantasy number 15.
Yep. You had people that he worked with, Ditko, Kirby. These are legends in art and in story writing. I mean, when these people got together and they decided to bring something out that was special, it was not your norm. You had small and very powerful comics that he was part of.
Right.
Spider-Man, when everybody was under psychedelic drugs and everybody was running around in a trance, dealing with drug abuse, one of the first things that they did. Racial equality. When it came down to people being who they were, we saw changes right through. You know, everybody knows who the Black Panther is due to the movies that were just recent. But do you know that before Ant-Man could grow really tall the way he was, there was a Goliath, and it was an African-American character, which was fantastic because it allowed us to see people in a different light. Luke Cage, you know.
Right.
You had people that went out there and did things that it was time that other people were included. The X-Men, you know, the changes that you had with Mutant Nation. You had the original X-Men, which were, you know, dealing with their own problems of being not accepted for who they really were and trying to hide their identity so nobody would bother their families.
Yeah.
Then you had the government chasing them. Then you had evil guys on top of it, you know, and the evil guys, a lot of them early on were just misunderstood. Magneto, he lived through the Holocaust, and, you know, understanding what it is to, you know, have that much in your past weighing on your choices, you can't help him there. You can't help but to admire him for not destroying the world completely, and, you know, him turning out the way he did. You know, I have no ill feelings for Magneto. His family went through a lot. He went through a lot, and as he grew through the characters, and we saw that visually on the movies. We saw a lot of the changes that were there, but that was Stan Lee's writing that expressed all that. That was him bringing something to the forefront that everybody got to see. Now, as a child, I used to like the back of the Spider-Man, you know, comics. Right. You would see about past issues. People would send in comments about what was going on and how they felt it would translate and where it would go. And people were encouraged to sit there and write to Stan Lee. And originally I thought, you know, as a child, you know, this was a made-up individual, that there was no Stan Lee, that this was just some editor's name that was going to answer it, because he was in every one of the books. You saw Stan Lee pages in X-Men, you saw him in Spider-Man, you saw him in the Hulk, and, you know, after
Avengers
a while,
and so forth.
Right, and eventually you just, you know, don't believe that he's actually somebody. You just assume it's a pseudo name for everybody going to answer the editor's column. But, he was real, and, he had famous lines that he liked to use, yours.
Yep. Which I'll get into in a minute.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, I remember Stan Lee, like I said, when I was watching the Saturday morning cartoons at the time, in the 70s and 80s.
Yep.
Like I said, Spider-Man or Spider-Man's Amazing Friends or what have you. Stan Lee would always be saying, at the end of the beginning, saying, "Excelsior!"
Yep. And that was a catchphrase that he used that, it continued to move forward with him. You're talking about a gentleman that was born December 28th, 1922.
Yeah. And his original name was Stanley Martin Lieber.
Yeah. And he shortened the Lieber because, well, unfortunately, during his upbringing, the Jewish community did not get the recognition that they should have for their contributions, and he chose the name Lee. And he carried that on with him throughout the books. Did he bring a lot of who he is himself to the comic book world? No. He didn't say, well, I'm a comic book writer and I'm doing this and somebody else has got to do this. No. He sat there and he took world experiences and brought them forward.
Yeah. He made actually the heroes more normal people instead of...
Exactly. He sat there and made you feel something for your hero. Not just compassion because they were doing right, or not just feeling of who they were. He sat there and enlightened us all. He decided that, this was not just showmanship, but there was a story that needed to go beyond. At the time, they were competing early on with different comic book companies, and there were a lot at the beginning. A lot failed. Marvel went through some tough times, but Stan Lee and the rest of the guys, they weathered the storm. They decided that movies were a good venue. They got some really good graphics as time went on. Now you can look back at the original Marvel movies, and some of them will make you laugh. If you look back at how they were produced, what went into doing what they did.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I can remember the 70s Captain America.
Yep.
And the 70s Amazing Spider-Man live-action TV show.
Yep. And those were somewhat of a response to, how powerful Batman went over. When Batman came out, he took over everything. Yep. Stan Lee and the rest of the guys at Marvel decided to put that aside and tried to counter that with their own shows. Now, eventually, you had a lot of the top artists that brought a new feeling during the 80s to comics. And by the 90s, they left. They created Image. I won't mention their names on this episode because it's not about them. But when they left a vacuum. And Stan Lee went in and he hired in a bunch of new artists, and a lot of the people that were sub-working for him, he promoted them. And he continued on the field. Even though he lost the talent of those artists, if you look at the storyline, it was still there. Yep. Nobody ever stopped the storylines. Nobody ever said, no, we can't do it. The government tried. They put a rating on comics, and they tried to slow down Stan Lee. And sometimes he actually got a T rating, or he got an M rating on some comics, because you had to present them in advance to the government to get their authorization and their stamp on whether or not you could do that. Eventually, that got thrown out, and it took time, but it did a lot on the storylines. So they did a lot of better storylines to make you understand where they were with it.
Like I said, Stan Lee apparently wasn't too hip into the drug situation back in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
As for, like I said, because he didn't know about the MJ for Mary Jane from Spider-Man.
Yep.
As for being referred to as marijuana.
Exactly.
Or Bruce Banner, being the Bruce meaning the term for gay at the time.
Right.
That's the reason why when they did the Incredible Hulk TV series. They changed the name from Bruce Banner to David Banner.
Yep. Well, there were a lot of changes along the way, but he stepped up his game, and Marvel did some things that nobody else ever decided at the early 90s, late 80s. Came out with a spin-off from the X-Men,
Yeah.
okay, which was Alpha Flight. And when Alpha Flight came out, they sat there and they had one of the first openly gay superheroes.
Yep.
And when they did that, because he excelled in speed, was his power, unfortunately, he contracted AIDS and he went from 0 to 100% being AIDS positive because of his natural ability with speed.
Yeah.
That ravished him and he died. And it was quite a storyline that nobody ever gave Stan Lee credit for actually bringing that out. Now you think of the audience that most comics reach is between 9 and 17, you know, before collectors got involved with comics. And when that came out, he was actually showing something that was a topic in the newspapers that everybody was speaking of, but he brought it to the forefront so kids could understand it and ask questions.
Yep.
You know, being able to ask questions of your parents and getting a straight answer is a fantastic way for these comics to be able to excel and to use those as a learning block. When I was a child, one of my favorite comics was Iron Man. Later on in life, you know, soldering electronics, working on computers, I have to say it goes back to Iron Man. It goes back to Tony Stark and wanting to build something.
Yep.
Because that's what I read, that's what I understood.
Yeah. And Stan Lee affected more than just Marvel. He had an effect on DC and the other independents that are out there.
Oh, yeah.
Even though DC's not an independent.
Right. But DC, being who they are, a lot of the idea of them moving forward with non-animated movies, like the Justice League that they recently did, was because of Stan Lee and Marvel.
The Avengers and whatnot.
Yeah, the Avengers, the X-Men. They saw how powerful it was to reach an audience so vast and bring a new generation to the table. We're old school, and there's not a question about that. Now, most people, and I want you to understand that when it comes to comics, we sit there and we can look back at the Silver Age, the Golden Age, we can look at the Modern Age, and we can come ahead and look at the newer ones.
Yeah.
What do I look for when I see a comic? Not only story, the graphics, what pops off the page, but I don't want it to wrap up in one story.
Yep.
You know, and the idea of continuing a comic and ending and going further, that was Marvel all the way.
Yep.
Now, when it came to DC and a lot of the other ones, they didn't know if you were going to buy the next issue. So they ended whatever the problem was, and they wrapped it all up.
Yep.
You know, the bad guys were put away, and the heroes are heroes. Well, it became very known that Marvel would make twists. Look, the X-Men had a revolving door of people coming and going, and so did the Avengers. You didn't know what Avenger was going to have what seat, who was going to be in charge. Every year, they had a call for the Avengers on who the new roll call was going to be.
I just wish Stan Lee had a bigger input on the TV series that are Marvels.
Yes.
Maybe then they would have been as big of a hit as the movies.
Yeah, exactly. Now, one of the problems that you see with a lot of the storylines are that they've diverted from the old characters and decided to have a new path. Well, a lot of that, when it happened, Stan Lee voiced, you know, tremendous arguments against getting away from the original stories. Those are what made Marvel strong. Changing, you know, the characters, and I want to say it for the right way. You know, before we had Captain Marvel, and I don't want to say Captain Marvel, it's Captain Marvel.
Yeah.
Before we had Captain Marvel, and the new one that's going to be in the new movie coming out.
Right.
We had two others prior to that.
Yep.
And one was a gentleman and one was yet another African American young lady. And the cartoons drew them great. It was perfect. And now we have a Caucasian woman
Yep.
going to play it in the next Avengers movie.
Yep.
They need to be true to the comics and be more inclusive. They need to have a balance in their ethnicity.
I wonder if this Caucasian woman in the movie, she's going to actually be the Linda was it Linda, whatever, it was Captain Marvel.
Yeah.
I can't remember her last name.
I don't either. But
No, it was Carol Danvers.
Carol Danvers.
I was getting mixed up with Supergirl Linda Danvers.
Right. And you have another question when it comes to that. Once they introduce the new Captain Marvel, are they going to have the teenager that took the name Captain Marvel? Okay.
Who knows?
She was inspired by her hero
Yeah.
when she grew up, so that's what she named herself.
Because, like I said, from the clips I've seen of the Captain Marvel, it looks like it's going to be the Carol Danvers. She's getting glimpses of her past.
Yeah. So that means that they're going to wipe out the large history, and they're going to try. I wish Marvel all the success that they've always had. I want to say something for the family and for everybody that knew Stan Lee personally. He brought passion. He brought a sense of humor.
And joy.
To millions of people. When we got to see him on shows like The Big Bang, or we got to look for him on the Cameo, it was something that we all sat around and did and do. Thank you. Thank you, Stan Lee, for everything you did. And we want to say that we wouldn't have the rest of these people. You've got so many different characters that you brought us. Would we have them in our lives if it wasn't for someone like him who didn't want to be one-sided? Everything he did was to make it bigger and better for everybody.
Yep.
Yep.
Well, that's it for our show today. Please like and subscribe. And for a big thank you for Stan Lee, Excelsior.